Hey, stop scrolling for just 1 second. Every 4th of July, Americans fire up the grill, shoot off fireworks, and celebrate being the greatest military power the world has ever seen. The flags go up, the anthems play, children wave sparklers in the summer heat, and somewhere in the back of every American's mind lives this quiet, unshakable confidence. We are the good guys, we are the winners, and history has proven it over and over again. And look, that pride is not baseless. The revolution was a genuine miracle, a ragtag collection of colonies defeating the most powerful empire on Earth through sheer willpower and brilliant strategy. World War II cemented America's place as the arsenal of democracy, the nation that tipped the scales and saved the world from fascism. These are real achievements. These are earned celebrations. But there is one war sitting quietly in the middle of American history, wedged between the glorious Revolution and the dramatic Civil War, that Americans also celebrate, also feel proud of, also point to as proof of their national toughness. A war that produced the national anthem, a war that launched one of the most beloved presidents in history, a war that Americans will tell you with complete confidence they won. And they didn't. They lost. Badly. Embarrassingly. In ways that would make a modern cable news network combust entirely if it happened today. The British marched into Washington, D.C. and burned the White House to the ground. The invasion of Canada, which was supposed to be, in Thomas Jefferson's own words, a mere matter of marching, collapsed so completely that American generals were surrendering entire armies without fighting. The very demands that America went to war over were completely abandoned by the time the peace treaty was signed. America got nothing. Zero. The border went back to exactly where it was before the war started. And yet, Americans celebrate this war. They teach it as a victory. They named a hotel chain after the general who won the last battle. They play the song it inspired before every single sporting event every single day in stadiums across the country. So, what is going on? How does a nation lose a war and walk away feeling like a champion? And more importantly, why does the truth about this war matter so much more than the myth? That is what this video is about. And by the time we are done, you will never think about American history or American identity the same way again. To understand the War of 1812, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1812. And the world in 1812 was a place of almost incomprehensible chaos. Europe was not just at war, it was at war in the way that reshapes civilizations. Napoleon Bonaparte had torn the old order apart and was rebuilding the continent in his own image. France and Britain were locked in a death struggle, but impressment was only half of the problem boiling under the surface of American politics. Out on the western frontier, in the territories that would eventually become Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois, American settlers were pushing relentlessly into Native American land. And the native tribes were not simply stepping aside. They were organized, they were armed, and they were fighting back with a ferocity that terrified frontier settlements. And Americans were convinced, with significant evidence to support the conviction, that Britain was behind this resistance. British agents operating out of Canada were maintaining relationships with native tribes along the frontier. British traders were supplying those tribes with weapons and goods. British officials were, at minimum, encouraging native resistance to American expansion as a way of maintaining a buffer zone between the United States and British Canada. Whether Britain was actively orchestrating this resistance or simply allowing it to happen is a matter of historical debate. But from the American perspective, the conclusion was the same. Britain was arming their enemies. Britain was encouraging attacks on American settlements. Britain was using Native Americans as a proxy force to slow American growth and keep the young republic weak and contained. So you have this combination of pressures building through the first decade of the 19th century. A young nation, only 30 years removed from its revolution, still deeply insecure about its place in the world. A nation whose sailors were being kidnapped on the open ocean. a nation whose frontier settlers were being attacked by warriors they believed were being armed by a foreign power. A nation that had tried diplomacy, tried protest, tried trade restrictions, and been ignored every single time. The resentment was real, the anger was legitimate, and into this pressure cooker walked a group of congressmen who would be called the Warhawks. The Warhawks were a faction of young, aggressive nationalist congressmen, primarily from the South and the West, who believed that America's problems with Britain could only be solved by force. Their most prominent voices were Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. These were not timid men. These were men who looked at the map of North America and saw possibility. Because here is the thing about the Warhawks that the history books sometimes soften. Yes, they were genuinely angry about impressment. Yes, they were genuinely concerned about British interference on the frontier. But they also saw this war as an opportunity for something much bigger than defense of American honor. They saw Canada. Britain's Canadian colonies sat right there on the northern border, stretching from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. And in 1812, those colonies were not populous, not heavily defended, and not particularly loyal to Britain in the way that would inspire fierce resistance. The total population of British Canada in 1812 was somewhere around 300,000 people, a mix of British loyalists who had fled America after the Revolution, French Canadians who had lived under British rule since 1763, and recent immigrants from various places. America, by contrast, had 7.5 million people. Thomas Jefferson himself, writing from his retirement at Monticello, expressed the view that the acquisition of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. Just send the army north. The Canadians would probably welcome American liberation from British rule. The small British garrison couldn't possibly resist the American population advantage. The thing would be done before winter. This was the confidence, or perhaps the arrogance, of the Warhawks, and it was contagious. On June 18, 1812, President James Madison, a man who was personally reluctant about the war but had been politically maneuvered into a corner from which he could not escape without appearing weak, signed the declaration of war against Great Britain. The vote in Congress was the closest declaration of war in American history. 79 to 49 in the House.
William Hull was absolutely terrified of him. Hull wrote letters describing the native forces in panicked, almost hysterical terms. He became convinced that if he advanced further into Canada, his supply lines would be cut, his army would be surrounded, and his men would be massacred. The fear paralyzed him. So Hull retreated back to Detroit. And then, on August 16, 1812, in one of the most humiliating moments in the history of the United States Army, General William Hull surrendered the entire garrison of Detroit, over 2,000 men, all their artillery, all their supplies, to a British force that was actually smaller than his own. He surrendered without a major battle. He essentially handed Detroit to the British because he was afraid of what might happen if he didn't. The shock in America was total. Hull was eventually court-martialed and sentenced to death for cowardice and neglect of duty. President Madison pardoned him on account of his Revolutionary War service, but the damage to American confidence and credibility was severe. And it was only August. The war had barely started. The second major invasion attempt came in October 1812 at the Battle of Queenston Heights on the Niagara frontier. American forces managed to cross the Niagara River and seize a commanding position on the heights above the town of Queenston. For a moment, it looked like a genuine American success. The British commander, General Isaac Brock, one of the most capable officers in the entire war, was killed leading a counterattack. His death was a devastating blow to British Canada. But then, something almost comically disastrous happened on the American side. The New York State Militia, which was supposed to cross the river and reinforce the men fighting on the heights, refused to go. Their argument was technically legal. They had enlisted to defend the state of New York, not to invade foreign territory. Crossing into Canada was outside the scope of their enlistment, and they were not going to do it. So the American soldiers who had crossed the river and taken the heights, perhaps 1,000 men, were left there, without reinforcement, without support, surrounded by British regulars and Canadian militia who counterattacked with everything they had. The Americans were forced to surrender. Hundreds were killed or captured. The battle that might have been an American breakthrough became another American disaster. The third invasion attempt, further east along the St. Lawrence River, never really materialized at all. The commanding general decided the season was too far advanced, the troops were not ready, and an attack would be inadvisable. He went into winter quarters. Canada remained firmly British. By the end of 1812, the United States had launched 3 major invasion attempts against Canada. All 3 had failed. America had lost Detroit, the most important American outpost in the Northwest. American generals had been embarrassed, court-martialed, or proven completely incompetent. The easy conquest Jefferson had predicted was not just delayed, it was looking increasingly impossible. In Britain, to the extent that anyone was paying attention through the fog of the Napoleonic Wars, there was mild amusement. The Americans had declared war on the most powerful empire on Earth, invaded Canada, and gotten thoroughly thrashed. The whole thing seemed almost farcical from the British perspective. In America, there was shock, shame, and the slow, painful realization that this war was not going to be quick, easy, or glorious. 1913 brought some relief and some further humiliation in equal measure, depending on which theater of the war you were watching. On the Great Lakes,
Meanwhile, on the Atlantic Ocean, something unexpected was happening. The American Navy, tiny, outgunned, and by every rational calculation completely outclassed by the Royal Navy, was winning individual ship-to-ship battles with a frequency that was genuinely shocking to the British public. The USS Constitution, a heavy frigate, defeated 2 British warships in separate engagements with a thoroughness that made British naval officers question their assumptions about American seamanship. The Constitution's hull proved so resistant to British cannonballs, they seemed to bounce right off, that sailors gave her a nickname that has survived to this day: Old Ironsides. These naval victories were outsized in their importance relative to their actual strategic impact. America could not challenge Britain's overall naval dominance. There were simply too many British ships and too few American ones. But each single-ship victory was a propaganda triumph that boosted American morale at a time when the news from Canada was consistently terrible. And they were embarrassing to Britain. Embarrassing enough that the British Admiralty ordered their captains to avoid single-ship engagements with American frigates unless they had a significant advantage. The most powerful navy in the world instructed to avoid fighting American ships one-on-one. That was a kind of victory in itself, even if it could not turn the tide of the war. But if 1813 was a mixed picture, 1814 was the year everything fell apart for America. Because in 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte finally made one mistake too many. His catastrophic invasion of Russia in 1812 had broken the back of his Grand Army. Coalition forces closed in from all directions. In April 1814, Napoleon abdicated. The Napoleonic Wars were over. And Britain, which had been fighting for its survival for 20 years, suddenly had its hands free. Thousands of battle-hardened veterans, soldiers who had fought Wellington's campaigns across Spain and Portugal, men who had defeated the finest armies Napoleon could field, were now available for deployment to North America. The strategic situation changed overnight. Britain went from fighting a defensive war in Canada to planning an offensive war against the United States. The goal was no longer simply to hold Canada. The goal was to punish America for starting the war, to seize American territory that could be used as bargaining chips, and to demonstrate once and for all that picking a fight with the British Empire had consequences. 3 major British offensives were planned.
one in the north, pushing down from Canada through Lake Champlain toward New York, one in the Chesapeake Bay region targeting the American coast and potentially Washington itself, and one in the south aimed at seizing New Orleans and controlling the mouth of the Mississippi River, the economic jugular of the American interior. The Chesapeake campaign came first. A British fleet under Admiral Alexander Cochrane, with a land force under General Robert Ross, entered the Chesapeake Bay in August 1814. They moved with a confidence that came from knowing the American forces opposing them were badly organized and badly led. The Battle of Bladensburg, fought on August 24, 1814, just outside Washington, D.C., lasted approximately 90 minutes. American militia forces, poorly positioned and poorly commanded, broke and ran almost immediately when the British advance began. President Madison himself was present on the battlefield, the last.
In the north, the British offensive through Lake Champlain was stopped at the Battle of Plattsburgh in September 1814. American naval forces on Lake Champlain defeated the British fleet in a decisive engagement, and the British Army, deprived of naval support for its supply lines, withdrew back into Canada. This was a genuinely significant American victory. It effectively ended any British ambition to seize significant American territory in the north. By the autumn of 1814, both sides were exhausted and broke. Britain, having fought a world war for 20 years, was financially strained and its people were tired of conflict. The British public had little appetite for a prolonged American war when the real prize, peace and prosperity after the defeat of Napoleon, was right there waiting to be enjoyed. Trade with America had been profitable, and the trade embargo of the war years had hurt British merchants significantly. America was in even worse shape. The federal government was essentially bankrupt. The treasury was empty. Several New England states, which had opposed the war from the beginning, New England's economy depended on trade with Britain and the war had devastated it, were making noises about secession. Representatives from the New England states were literally meeting in Hartford, Connecticut to discuss their grievances with the federal government and, some feared, potentially withdrawing from the Union. Peace negotiations had actually been ongoing since 1813, grinding slowly forward in the Belgian city of Ghent. American negotiators, including the brilliant John Quincy Adams, had arrived demanding significant British concessions, an end to impressment, recognition of American maritime rights, British withdrawal from the Northwest, and abandonment of their native allies. The British negotiators had initially come to the table with their own ambitious demands, significant territorial concessions, a permanent native buffer state, American limitations on Great Lakes naval forces. As 1814 went on and both sides grew more tired and more financially strained, the demands on both sides quietly shrank. The native buffer state that would have honored Tecumseh's dream disappeared from British proposals. American demands about impressment similarly faded away. What was left, after months of negotiation, was a treaty that essentially said, stop fighting, go back to the way things were, and pretend this never happened. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24, 1814, Christmas Eve. It restored all territory to pre-war boundaries. It said nothing about impressment. It said nothing about maritime rights. It said nothing about British relations with native tribes. Every single issue that America had gone to war over was simply left unresolved. Historians have a technical term for this kind of peace agreement. They call it status quo ante bellum, return to the state before the war, which is a formal Latin way of saying that thousands of people died and nothing changed. The news of the peace treaty took weeks to cross the Atlantic, and in those weeks, actually in the days immediately before the treaty was signed, the third and most dramatic act of the war played out in the swamps and marshes south of New Orleans. The British Southern Offensive was the most ambitious of their three campaigns. New Orleans was the key to the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River was the key to the American interior. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the economic output of half a continent. The cotton, the grain, the timber, the furs that flowed down the river from the interior states and territories. If Britain could seize and hold New Orleans, they would have a stranglehold on American economy. America in early 1815 was in desperate shape. The capital had been burned. The treasury was empty. New England was threatening to leave the Union. The army had spent 2.5 years losing battles, surrendering forts, and failing to conquer Canada. The war had achieved none of its stated objectives. The peace treaty confirmed all of that failure in black and white. And then the news from New Orleans arrived. Jackson had won decisively, won humiliatingly for the British, won in a way that seemed almost too perfect. The frontier hero, the ragtag army, the impossible odds, the crushing victory over the professional soldiers of the greatest empire on earth. America did not receive this news soberly and then read the peace treaty carefully and note that the war had actually ended in a draw at best. America received this news like a starving man receiving a meal. The celebration was immediate, total, and completely untethered from the actual strategic context. Newspapers declared total victory. Preachers called it divine providence. Politicians who had supported the war claimed vindication. Politicians who had opposed the war quietly stopped talking about their opposition. The Treaty of Ghent, which said absolutely nothing about American victory and required nothing of Britain that America had demanded, was reframed as Britain's acknowledgement that America could not be beaten. The narrative that formed in those weeks of celebration in early 1815 was not a lie exactly. It was something more subtle and more interesting than a lie. It was selective emphasis taken to its logical extreme. Yes, the treaty restored the pre-war boundaries, but America had defended those boundaries against the most powerful military in the world. Yes, impressment was not addressed in the treaty, but Britain never impressed another American sailor after 1815, partly because the Napoleonic Wars were over and Britain no longer needed to. Yes, the invasion of Canada had failed completely, but Jackson had won at New Orleans, and somehow that became the defining image of the entire conflict. The war became, in American memory, the Second War of Independence, a confirmation that America could stand up to Britain and survive, a proof of national toughness and democratic resilience, the story of a young nation that had been tested and had not broken. There was genuine truth in that story. America had survived a war against the most powerful empire on earth, while simultaneously dealing with internal division, financial crisis, and military incompetence on a spectacular scale. That was a real achievement. The Union had held together when it could easily have fractured. The government had functioned, however poorly, under extraordinary pressure. But surviving a war is different from winning one. And the gap between those two things, between what actually happened and what Americans told themselves happened, is one of the most instructive gaps in the history of national mythology. So what did the War of 1812 actually accomplish? If it wasn't a victory, if it didn't achieve its stated objectives, if it ended in a draw, what did it do? Quite a lot, actually, just not what anyone expected going in. The war effectively ended the threat of Native American resistance east of the Mississippi. This is one of those outcomes that is very difficult to discuss without confronting its moral weight directly. Tecumseh's death and the collapse of his Confederacy removed the last realistic hope for organized Native resistance to American expansion. The tribes that had fought alongside the British were abandoned in the peace negotiations. Britain didn't even try to secure protections for its Native allies, which says everything about how Britain viewed that alliance. What followed over the next several decades was the forced removal of Native peoples from the eastern United States, the Trail of Tears, the destruction of dozens of cultures, one of the greatest human rights catastrophes in American history. The War of 1812 did not cause all of that, but it removed a critical barrier to it. The war also, paradoxically, created Canada, or rather it created Canadian identity. Before 1812, the idea of a distinct Canadian nationality, separate from Britain, defined by its own values and history, barely existed. British Canada was just a collection of colonies. but the experience of being invaded, of successfully defending against a much larger neighbor, of rallying together across the linguistic divide between English and French Canada created something new. Canadian historians often call the War of 1812 the war that made Canada.
The British burned the White House, and America rebuilt it. That is true. American sailors were impressed, and American honor was violated, and America went to war rather than accept that violation. That is true. The army was a mess, and the invasion of Canada was a disaster, but the nation survived and the government endured. That is true. Andrew Jackson won at New Orleans with an army that looked like America itself. Diverse, scrappy, improbable, effective. That is true. These things are all true. The story built from them is not false. It is incomplete. And the incompleteness matters. It matters because the parts of the story left in shadow, the abandoned Native allies, the enslaved people who fought for their freedom and were returned to bondage after the war, the Canadians who successfully defended their home and built a nation from that defense, the military failures that were never fully reckoned with. These are not footnotes. They are essential parts of what this war was and what it meant. The War of 1812 is a mirror, and what you see in it depends entirely on where you are standing when you look. From the American side, you see survival, resilience, and the birth of a national identity that was no longer defined solely by its relationship to Britain. You see Old Ironsides and the Star-Spangled Banner and Andrew Jackson at New Orleans, and you feel the pride of a young nation that was tested and held. From the Canadian side, you see the war that made your country, the battle where French and English Canadians fought side by side against an invader, the moment when a distinct Canadian identity crystallized out of the fire of conflict. You see Loris Accord walking 20 miles through the dark to warn British forces. You see the militia at Queenston Heights holding a position that professional soldiers might have abandoned. You see the beginning of a national story that is still told with pride today. From the perspective of the Native peoples who fought in this war, you see the tragedy most clearly. Because the War of 1812 was not just America's war. It was Canada's war. It was Tecumseh's war. It was the war of thousands of enslaved people who saw in the British promise of freedom a chance for something America had denied them. It was the war of sailors from a dozen nations who found themselves impressed into navies they had not chosen, fighting for causes they had not been asked about. Rises and the crowd goes quiet. I want you to think about Fort McHenry in the dark. About Francis Scott Key on that British ship, watching the shells arc through the night, not knowing if the flag would still be there in the morning. The song is not about victory. It is about uncertainty. It is about the terrifying, honest question of whether the thing you love will survive the night. And then it is about the relief, the profound, almost disbelieving relief of seeing that it has. America asked that question in 1812. The answer was not a triumph. It was survival. It was continuation. It was the flag still there in the morning, battered and smoke-stained, but flying. Maybe that is enough to celebrate. Maybe survival, genuine, hard-won, uncertain survival, deserves its own kind of pride. But now you know the whole story. And knowing the whole story is always better than knowing only the part that makes you feel good.